the more you can be all of who you truly are, not only the happier you will be, but the world will be better for it.
Welcome to the Poetic Encouragement Podcast Series. This is my first interview, and please let me introduce my guest, my dear friend Cat. I met Cat Charissage about 9 years ago at a lunch group, and she invited me to her poetry circle where we read poetry and journal about the poems we discuss. Our friendship deepened over the years, and she is one of my biggest supporters on so many levels. She is my co-pilot at my monthly open mic poetry events. She is one of the most supportive people of my work on Substack and every other platform I'm on. Cat is the best figurative gardener I have ever seen. She plants seeds of love and wisdom, spreads them everywhere they are needed to help people flourish and grow into beautiful beings with reduced pain and more ease. She has a keen eye to analyze your situation, read between the lines, and see what is needed to help you move forward, and you will end up smelling like a rose, feeling vibrant and alive. I have seen Kat and her family many times to step up to the plate, to help people in reaching their goals, and offer their support in many, many ways. Kat is the author of a book, and guess what it's called? Wildflower Seeds, The Beauties of a Reflective Life. I guess she is spreading more seeds of love to more and more people. She will give you many tips to enrich your life with her simple but profound practices in her book. Kat is also a poet and visual artist. Her deep thoughts, her beauty, and her spirit shines through her poetry, her painting, and the rest of her art. She has been drawn to Islamic geometric patterns lately and has created some amazing pieces while she is going through some debilitating physical pain and limiting changes in, as she calls it, her dear body. I could tell you a lot more about Kat because I love and admire her so much, but I'm going to ask her some questions and let her do most of the talking from here. Welcome to the Poetic Encouragement Podcast Series, Kat. Thank you for being my first guest.
Thank you so much, Terry, for that introduction. I think you should keep it. And when I finally die and have a funeral, you should just read that because that's the best I've ever heard myself described ever. All I have to do now is live up to it.
You don't have to live up to anything. These are based on the things you do for us, and we really love you and appreciate you. So let's start with Adam and Eve. When did you start liking poetry and art, and which one came first, your visual art or your poetry?
Wow, now that's an interesting question because I was raised at a time when my parents had no appreciation or value for art or poetry or anything like that. So from the time I was a little kid, I was steered into the sciences, and my father's dream for me was to become a physician. Well, as life happens, I was good enough at it that I was able to get into many different programs. However, I never did go on to pre-med. And instead, I was just so interested in human beings and how we interact with each other, how we make each other miserable, and how we can also make each other very happy. So it wasn't until I was dealing with my own difficulties in growing up. Almost all of us have to face those growing up years at some point in time, that I felt so sad and so despairing at many times. And you know how someone will send you a poem in a letter, or will read you a quote from somebody that just sears to the truth. Well, that's what would happen with me. I would find different poems, and I'd, write them down by hand in all of my little journals and things like that. I even have two full big journals full of poems that I copied out myself over the years. Anyway, um, about 12 years ago now, I felt a depression coming up for me. Um, it was winter time. It was just before Christmas time, and I was realizing that um, things were going to be bad that winter if something didn't change. So I ended up. I went into meditation thinking, what is it that I need? What do I need? And I realized I needed more color. And I'm thinking, color. Like, what do you mean by that? Well, and a few days later, not when I was thinking about this color business at all, but totally randomly, so to speak, I began remembering that I knew an artist from a workshop we had been to together. And I just wondered, I wonder what she's up to. I wonder what she's doing, I wonder if she has a website. So I looked her up, and she certainly does. She's quite an entrepreneur um in intentional creativity, and she has had many courses online as well. So I took one of the courses, and then it's all history from there on, in the sense that I just really had a way now to express my inner thoughts and feelings, the good and the bad, the hopeful, in a way that could bring it out of all of the jumble in my heart and guts and head, and bring it out in front of me so that I could take a look at it and decide then what to do with any of it, if there was anything that needed to be done. I went on to take several year-long courses with that artist, and um, I wouldn't say I've moved on exactly, but I've gone into other and newer different kinds of expression. One of the wonderful things that Shiloh did in her courses was she always had the painting, the vision, the image go along with word. So she would always put the two together. She would insist that we had a little notebook with us every time we painted, and that as words came to mind as we were, you know, doing things, that we would write those words down. And then she invited at the end of every poem, at the end of every painting, that we would string those words together, add to them, play with them, and come up with a poem for just about every one of my paintings that I've done. And that's where I began to fall in love with poetry. When I was in school, we had all the kinds of poets that I didn't understand what they were talking about. It always seemed like they were speaking in code. They always had all of these references to ancient literature or contemporary literature. They always had all these references to things that I didn't know about. And it made me feel stupid, and it made me feel like I wasn't getting the joke. And so that didn't pull to me until my friends would start to send me these other poems. Well, around that time in my life, I found the poet Mary Oliver. And, you know, she's the patron saint of all of us poets in this particular style of poetry. And we love her, and we're so grateful for her. One of the things that's wonderful about her, or that's so interesting about her, is that she is so incredibly well loved. She died recently, and she's so incredibly well loved, and her books are sold in the millions. She's very, very popular. Women, especially, share her poems all the time, and yet she was never um, accepted in the in group of literary poets, where critics would, you know, uh, support the other poets in their own books and in their own publishing, things like that. She was kind of an outsider, and I think it was because she wrote in a way that everyone can understand. I know how good her poetry is. And then when I saw that the elite literary establishment did not consider her one of them, it reminded me that just because experts say that it's so, it may not necessarily be the truth at all. I mean, I had known that in my head before, of course, but that's when it really stuck in me. And it really began to encourage within me much more expression of my deepest self and finding and looking for what's going on in that deepest self. Um, the fact that Mary Oliver uh, wrote such beautiful poetry and yet was not considered like the poet of the year or the poet laureate or anything like that, gave me permission to realize that my poetry doesn't have to be measured against anyone else's, that it can be expressing from my deepest heart and deepest self, and that's what the greatness or the goodness in poetry is. The greatness of poetry is it faithful to the experience or image or emotion that gave rise to it? And if you can help me feel that in the words that you choose, then that's definitely a successful poem.
I have to agree with you on that. And I really wish I had our sign that you and I, well, actually, you made the sign, but you and I started a program, call it Tell It Like It Is, or what is it?
Yeah, tell it like it is poetry.
Tell It Like It Is Poetry. And are both you and I focused on getting real and deep. And that's where the beauty of poetry and conversation and connections and so many things are born.
Well, this is right. I was raised a good little Catholic girl, and so I was raised to be very nice. And I even remember my father telling me when I started dating, now don't show off to the boys. Like, don't let them see that you're smarter than they are. I thought that was kind of funny, but it's so indicative of how it was when I was growing up. And fortunately, I did end up marrying someone who, well, maybe he's not as smart as I am. No, he is definitely, just in different ways. But he's very definitely my match when it comes to, the thinking, the intellect, the expression, things like that. So I didn't have to hide any of who I was with him, which is really good.
I am so glad you're with him and you don't have to hide who you are. You can be your true self, and he's supportive of every piece of you. I think you just found the perfect mate.
Well, yes, but it didn't just happen either. We were together and apart and together and apart for almost 15 years before we really settled into life is better with him than without him. So,
I'm glad you came to that decision. Well, I guess you answered my first three questions. Would you like to talk about anybody else who was a big influence in your life as far as poetry or art goes?
yes, Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Um, I I was a in grade school and high school during the Cold War, and we were constantly being told to pray that the Soviets would not come and bomb us in our beds overnight. This was in second grade, the old nun having us kids pray 2 or 3 times a day that we would not be bombed and killed in the middle of the night, and that we wouldn't have our parents killed and be alone as orphans. Um, I know she was old and tired and miserable herself, but she really terrorized, all of these little 7-year-olds. Anyway, somehow I really got attracted to this idea of writers who were imprisoned for their views, writing on little snatches of paper or writing in like in between the lines of the Bible that they were able to have in their prison cell, or writing on little pieces of cigarette paper, and then smuggling them out when they would have a visitor, and then, those words being published and it being very much the truth of what was going on. Most of the time, it was also very inspiring in terms of, um, finding your own inner truth and not being led astray by groups of people that just want to control you. Um, I had always wanted to be a writer from the time I was really little. Also, in my own home, I mean, my version of it, of the difficulties at home, was that I could not be who I was. I'd never dared to have a diary or a journal because I knew it would be read. And so this whole idea of secret words and sneaking them out, all of that happened. So it wasn't until I left home that I actually started writing journals. And I have written so many journals that I have about 17 banker's boxes full of them over the years and stuff. And so it's interesting that for someone who, in all of my different uh, jobs, survival jobs that I've always written, it's always been a part of my life. I had never, except for the journal writing, I had never written what I had wanted to get out. Um, and so the time of COVID, it was part of it was a real gift for me. And that real gift was keeping me home. I had already decided that I had wanted to write a particular book, kind of a book, and that was on different types of depth dimension practices. I really believe that soul life, not religious life, but our soul life and what it is that nourishes us from deep within, those questions that we have from deep within, that is an extremely important part of a human life that is in danger of being wiped out completely in our culture. I have just run into so many people who have needed to leave their religion of origin, as I call it, um, for very good reasons, usually. I mean, there was either abuse or hypocrisy or no answers from anyone in the churches for the kinds of really, really difficult situations people were going in, no guidance, no juice, no life with it. But then what do you do after that? Because this is a huge part of our lives that needs to be recognized, nourished, developed, grown. And so I decided that I really wanted to write about spirituality, but in a way that was outside of, alongside of, I'm not bashing religion for those who find meaning in it, but I wanted something that both those who found meaning in religious ideas and symbols and practices and services, that also the people who could not find meaning in those things could still begin to develop their own soul, develop their own spirituality. And so that's the book that I wrote. I just happen to have a copy here, of course. This is my book, Wildflower Seeds. And the seeds that I'm talking about in the book is that every time you take a 20-minute session to know your own heart, to believe in who you are, despite all of the voices around you that are saying what they think you ought to be, that that's another seed planted. It's a wildflower seed planted. It isn't one of those orchids put in an environment that it's not good for it, but it's the ordinary beauty of everyday life that the powers that be like to bulldoze those places and cover it with a parking lot. Um, but I just love the idea of a meadow in springtime or any place you're out in nature. And every time I see what some people call a weed, even the lowly old dandelion, um, I just get so excited because it's like I'm saying, yes, yes, you made it despite the efforts to push you down. And that's what I want for everybody. And that's what the book is filled with. It's got almost 100 different kinds of practices, because I know that not everybody is into meditation and not everybody is into writing journals, which are the two main ways that our culture has of supporting people who are interested in building their soul life at all. And so there's a whole lot of different ways in the area of image, and that would be simple art practices. Like, I mean, simple practices using color and drawing rather than art, as in coming up with something that's worth putting on the wall. So image, word, playing with all kinds of words and ideas and poetry and um, descriptions of things that are, again, meant to like pull you inward, to know who you are, and then to inspire you to move outward, to be here with us. We need everybody here in order to create a decent world. And then there's also silence, different ways of being in silence, like to listen for the wisdom that's within. And there's also embodiment, different ways of using the body, everything from Tai Chi and yoga to creating nature mandalas in your yard every morning. A friend of mine uh, created a new mandala out of leaves and stones and flower buds and pieces of leaves and sticks every day in her yard for over a month, and she photographed it every day. And if that isn't a spiritual practice, a depth dimension practice, I don't know what is. um and the other and then the final part that I find really filled with mystery, but so great riches, is dream. So I have a whole section on dream work. And I'm not talking just about the dreams that you have at night, but the kind of dreams, the daydreams that you might have during the day, the interactions you might have with someone during the day that keep with you, the ones that keep going over and over and over in your head that you can't get any resolution about. Well, I offer for a simple 4-step program for working with the dreams, so that you can you can start to get the deeper meaning. You can kind of get, it's sort of like with a dream, you get the description and the imagery, but you don't get told what it's about. And so that's what we get to do. It's by looking at the imagery, the words that are using, the actions, who the characters are, that kind of thing. Then we get to know a little bit more of what it is that our hearts are trying to tell us, that our hearts already know, but haven't yet been put into words for our head to know. So, um, I've had so many teachers over the years. My most recent long-term teacher has been Dr. Clarissa Pincola Estes, who back in the 90s wrote the book Women Who Run with the Wolves, which was an international bestseller. And it was filled with stories, stories that told the stations and the developments in people's lives, geared primarily towards women, but many, many, many men have found just as much wealth in it as I have. She started teaching workshops about 12 years ago, and I've been to 19 of her week-long intensives over the past number of years. Unfortunately, dear body's not working so well, and I can't go to any more of them right now. But yeah, she's been a great teacher.
Can I ask you what inspires you to write poetry or do your art?
What inspires me to write poetry is to communicate with others um, in a short way. Nobody has to commit to listening to me talk for 20 minutes or an hour or read a book, but in a few lines, 16 lines, 32 lines, 64 lines, I can get across a message of encouragement or hope or awareness. And so I love it that I call poetry condensed speech. So instead of all the words around, like I'm talking right now, there's just a few lines that get to the point of it. Of course, I'm also inspired to write poetry when I'm feeling um, really sad or despairing or in a lot of pain. I don't usually share those as much because while I totally believe that each of us need to be able to express our deepest pains and the hard stuff in our lives, we don't need to spread it all over in the sense that I do not want to identify as a survivor of abuse. Although I am a survivor of abuse, I I want to I want to stand up for the fact that healing is available and uh, out there and within. So I'm also inspired, really practically, by the fact that we have the open mic at All Poetry here in town once a month. And there is an opportunity to read my poems to the public. And I really enjoy that a lot. And I really feel privileged and a richness in my life being able to help provide a context for people to get up there and tell their truths.
What is or are your most common themes that you work with?
Themes that I work with most is how to strengthen ourselves in the midst of a world that has gone crazy.
Mm.
Um, Not only do we all have to deal with um, our individual lives and experiences of hardship or abuse or disappointment or people not understanding us, but we have to deal now with um, leaders who tend much more towards tyranny rather than open democracy. And how do we move forward in that? How do we find allies, alignment with others? The biggest tool of any oppressor is to make you feel alone, isolated, and that if you speak out, no one will listen to you and they will laugh at you and they will use it as a way to hurt you more. But we have to speak out. We have to find each other, to strengthen each other, and bring um, bring about social change as time goes by. When I'm speaking of social change, of course, I'm speaking about political change. However, more so, I'm speaking about the change in everyday lives of instead of when I come across someone that I know in the grocery store, instead of like, oh my God, did you hear what so and so did lately? I can't believe that. Instead of leading with that tone of voice all of the time with another legitimate complaint, to somehow be saying, how was your day? Did you get your roses in the ground yet? Um, did your kids come to see you lately? What are they up to these days? To be able to speak from the heart to the heart rather than using every opportunity to use other people as a listening board for whatever I want to spill out. So it's the question of how do we build um, support for each other, but also community in a way. As I am becoming as Dear Body is breaking down and I am becoming more disabled, I'm finding that one of my goals is always that anyone who interacts with me, that they leave feeling either fine or better than they were before, rather than leaving me and saying, oh my God, I'm not going to visit her again. She's such a downer, you know?
Oh yeah, that woman,
Yeah.
she's just so hard to be around.
That's it. That's it. She's just talking about herself all the time, or talking about stuff I can't, she has no control over whatsoever. But I understand all of those things too. And I don't at all want to put down people who are frightened and need to express that. Of course, there's times and places for that. But my motivation in writing is to help us understand why it is we do those things, but also how do we help build something, create something, not something big, but a wildflower garden?
Well, and you have a healthy balance between talking about the unpleasant things in life, but also to bring out the beautiful pieces because there's both of those. And we need to talk about both, but not be consumed by all the negativity. And I think you have a really good way of listening to people when they need to talk about their problems, but also to bring out the beautiful pieces.
Can I read you a poem about that?
Please do that. I was just going to ask you if you would like to read a poem. And of course, anytime you think there's a poem that ties in with our topic, please read it to us.
This one I wrote at Christmas time, um, just around December and January. I found out that the pain in my shoulders is not just the osteoarthritis that I thought it was, but that there's more going on, and that I actually need two, not one, but two complete shoulder replacements. And here in Canada, we have long waiting lists. So it might be anywhere from 4 months to a year before I get even the first one done. So that's a little bit bad news. So this is the poem I wrote in response to it. It's called Look Again. It's been a painful holiday. No, not emotionally, thank goodness. Been there, done that. But dear body is struggling now, grinding bone on bone in shoulders, ache in back, in legs, almost anywhere. It used to be that even if it hurt, I could choose to move. I could just grit my teeth and get her done. But not these days. I'm not used to asking for help, and I don't like it one bit. What if whoever I ask says no? How will I survive? I'm of the generation of women who planned and worked so hard to never be like our mothers, just one man away from welfare. And after all that work, here I am, one man away from welfare. And look again. That man just stopped by my study with an iced glass of Coke Zero, my favorite. Asked if there was anything he could get for me before he left for the gym. He hears me in the morning when I get out of bed and shows up to help me get my clothes over that bum shoulder. And tonight, he will help me get those same clothes over those same pain-filled shoulders. Then he'll get the covers on the bed just right. I have so much to be grateful for, right in the midst of pain. I just have to remember to look again. That's so true in all of our lives. I mean, you can say a platitude like, well, focus on the positive, but focusing on the positive somehow doesn't acknowledge how hard it is sometimes. Next one that I wrote was actually written for a friends of mine who had helped me with a really heavy chore of getting my website up and going. I call it Chosen Kin, Creating Kingdoms of Care. You know the line, the kingdom of heaven is within you? Well, instead of using kingdom, I use the word kingdom because kingdom for me is a community of relationships of people, whereas a kingdom, again, is another hierarchical kind of a metaphor that I don't think is appropriate in this day and age. So, chosen kin, creating kingdoms of care. We haven't been buddies from birth, haven't made memories in childhood or teens. There's so many stories we haven't yet shared, so much that we do not know. Yet, we don't have to know all the details to help each other out, to care, to choose each other by offering listening ear, making possible the other's way of life now. Scaffold of ordinary life, we stumble upon life's paths. We circle around the inchoate hope that love is our center, that love is possible, and that we can somehow be part of it. sharing struggles and ideas and joys and hopes. We are creating a kingdom of love with our imperfect selves, and it is good. I wouldn't be who I am without you. You, my friends, are my chosen kin. Living alongside each other, we create the kingdom of care as we muddle along in ordinary lives. Thank you, my friends. Thank you. We are together, friends, chosen kin, creating kingdoms of care.
Shall we move on to my next question?
Please.
What are your greatest joys in writing? And I think you partially answered that, but I'm sure there's more you'd like to add to it. So please go ahead.
Um, the greatest joy is finding a metaphor, a way of saying something in a short, pithy way that, like kingdoms of care. When that came to mind, it was like, yes, that's exactly the phrase I wanted. So when I find those phrases, or the idea of wildflowers as a metaphor, it's like I just I'm I'm not only satisfied, but I'm kind of delighted. It was like, where did that come from? The original title of my book, like the working title in my head, was mm, oh, now I can't remember it now. Oh, I know what it was. To live deeply is a political act. To live a spiritual life is a political act, or to live a deep life is a political act. And I knew even at the time that wasn't quite the title that I wanted. I mean, what I wanted to say was that if you think of politics as I do, which is anytime we're interacting with each other in some sort of community way, to do that well, we need to have a deep life and to know who we are and to decide what we want to bring to the community, to that, rather than, as I had mentioned before, just going around and dumping our garbage within us all over the place. And so I was going to bed one evening, and I was falling into that hypnagogic state, which is just, when you're relaxed and you're just starting to drift into sleep, and you get all of these weird ideas coming at you, and then you fall into sleep. Well, just at that time, before that, I was thinking, I need a metaphor. I was thinking of Dr. Estes and her metaphor for her book, Women Who Run with the Wolves. I mean, if that doesn't capture your imagination, I don't know what does. And I knew I needed a way of saying what I wanted to write about in that book in a way that would be memorable and capture the imagination. And that's when I realized that it just came to me, wildflowers. When my son was little and we used to go on a walk around the neighborhood every day, we would talk about dandelions as, beautiful flowers that are volunteer flowers all the time. And I would say that a lot of times people don't like them, but I would show him how to, blow all of the seeds off of them at the end, and things like that. And what I wanted to do was I wanted to go tell him to go and blow those seeds around everybody's yard. But I didn't. I am about community rather, and I want to have decent neighbors who don't hate me. I actually have a poem about that. Would you like me to read that one?
Please do.
I entitled it Faith, of all things. I believe in weeds. I know, heresy. It's not the first time I've been called a heretic. But really, look at them. No matter how you cut them down, dig them up, or try to kill them, you still get weeds. You gotta love that tenacity, that resilience. I know I do. Take crabgrass, hated by homeowners everywhere. Well, I'll take it. First up in spring, first up after a mowing, so bright green and luscious, screaming, "Here I am!" Or the chickweed growing in the cracks of my driveway. Little green leaves like a natural carpet. It's drive-in food. I pull into my driveway, lean over, and pick my salad greens for dinner. Chickweeds taste good. Even the price is right. It was a long winter this year. It was hard to believe that spring would ever return. But finally, in May, Mother Earth resurrected. And right after grass came up green, we had dandelions. I love dandelions. You can eat their leaves and their flowers, and their roots can cure just about anything that ails you. They're the first bouquet given by little boys to grateful mothers, their bright yellow smiling out from the green grass. When my son was little, I showed him how to blow off the seeds as we ambled along down the sidewalk so that everyone could have such beautiful dandelions right in their own front yards. Well, not really, but I wanted to. Mother Earth, carrier of the life cycle, you did it again this year. May I learn from your ways and rise again and again and again when I'm cut down by the world. Our Lady of the Resurrections, I have faith that you bring life even after the longest winter. I've seen it. Our Lady of the Resurrections, I believe in weeds.
That was lovely.
Another poem that I would like to read, I read it at All Poetry in response to a friend who used to read there a lot, but who was going through a really, really hard time. So I called it One More Day. Don't give up. I know. I know it's so hard. But where there's life, there is hope. Stay alive. One more day. One more day, and then again. One more day. Do whatever it takes to move to happiness. Okay, we'll settle for peace instead. Rest now. Sleep now. Hold on to your pillow. Hold on to your blankie. Hold on to yourself, your precious self. Hold on to one more day, and then for another day, and then again, one more day after that. The only thing life promises is change, so stick around. Don't miss the change that's a-comin'. From today to happiness. Okay, we'll settle for peace instead. You are so precious, dear struggling human being. Hold on. Stay alive. One more day. Okay? That was partially in response to my telling him whenever he would think of suicide, telling him, just postpone it until tomorrow. Like, you can always commit suicide, right? So do it tomorrow, and then do whatever you want today, right? Because you've already got plans for tomorrow. But whatever you want to do today, just go try it, make it happen. And the idea, of course, is that somebody will do something that brings them joy or fun, and then they feel good enough that when the next day comes, they don't quite feel like suicide that day either. So they put it off for one more day. So I'm encouraging them to live one day at a time.
Have you published any of your poetry?
I published a chapbook of my poems, and that was received really well. And I sold almost 300 copies of that first one. Yeah, and then I revised it and added a few more poems, including that poem "Faith," and uh, that's around too. Not only do I have my book, Wildflower Seeds, but I post on my Substack twice a month. I post on the new moon and on the full moon.
Well, then that brings us to our next question. Do you read your poems in public? And I know the answer, but I'd like you to tell everybody else the answer.
Well, yes, I do read it in public at our local Owl Poetry, which is an open mic poetry once a month at the Owl Acoustic Lounge, which is a restaurant, bar, music venue here in Lethbridge. The story of how that started is a really wonderful one. This open mic has been going well for 6 years. During COVID, we switched to online. More than 6 years for any kind of a community group to keep on going is pretty amazing. We don't Part of what works with it is that we don't have a big organization. No one is paid. There aren't any everybody who does anything in it is all volunteer. And we do it out of the love of our hearts. And what happened was that for a long time I had been doing what I call story circles, small groups of women, mostly women, for a number of weeks at a time, coming together around a topic. And it kind of didn't matter what the topic was. It would be like book groups, or groups on dreams, or groups on poetry. But the whole idea was teaching critical thinking and encouraging self-reflection. So when I was doing my poetry story circle and I met Terry and found out that she was interested in poetry, I invited her to come to the next beginning one, and she did, and she was enthusiastic as anything. She had been missing talking about poetry and writing poetry with other friends, and at the end of the round of the story circle, which was in summer, she called me up one day and said, I don't want to go all summer without poetry and without um, you know, reciting it aloud, without having other people coming together about this. And she says, what do you think about if I put together an open mic? And I said, oh, it sounds like a great idea, but I can't physically myself do the work. And she says, oh, no, that's no problem. I'll do all of that. And so, yeah, go for it, Terry. So I get off the phone thinking, oh, she's going to organize something, in one of the public rooms of the library, and there will be our people from my story circle, and maybe our family, and maybe an extra two or three friends, and the whole bit of like having 7 or 8 people who recite the poetry, and then having a whole like 10 or 12 people in the audience. Well, Terry calls me a few days later and says, we've got the owl. I said, what? And like, you need to know that the owl is like the happening place, or one of the happening places in Lethbridge. And it's not something that you would immediately think that middle-aged women poets would have much to do with. But the owner and manager there, I guess he had an open night and said sure when we were going to do the open mic. At the end of our first night, right from the floor, I remember him speaking out to Terry, hey, you want this to be a regular gig? And we said, sure. And we've been there every month since, except during COVID when we were online. And we still are going. And I'm so grateful.
Me too. I never thought it would grow into what it grows into. And I think it's a great example of the power of poetry and the power of words and the power of deep, meaningful connections. In your small group, it's a more intimate connection, but it expanded out into the city, and we connected with so many people. And it's still going, and the connections are still there. And so many friendships were formed during both of those, your small groups and the open mic. I'm really grateful for that.
We have all kinds of poets and poetry. Um, there's cowboy poetry. There's a sentimental kind of poetry that, every other line rhymes. Then there's people who get up there and just read from their journal, from their heart. And you want to say, I hadn't heard of like a poem like that before. There are people who have been published poets, some very, very fine wordsmiths. And then there are many people who get up there and say, this is the first time I've ever shared anything that I've ever written with anybody else. And we clap like crazy for them because we're not clapping for the quality of the poetry. We're clapping for the courage that it takes to express yourself and to share that in public.
That reminds me of one of my nicest experiences there when we had this gentleman. He must have been over 80, remember him?
Yeah.
And before he got up there, he told me he never spoke into a mic in public in his whole life. And then he went up and he read poems about his late wife, and half the room was in tears.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. If you could have lunch with a poet, dead or alive, who would it be and why?
Well, on the one hand, there's so many, and on the other hand, there's so few. Um, of course, love to have lunch with Mary Oliver. I'd also love to have lunch with Dr. Estes, Dr. Clarissa Pincola Estes, because as well as a writer and a workshop leader, she is a prolific poet, and her poetry is really down to earth. It's like they're cuentitos, they're little stories in and of themselves, and I like that. But actually, I think I'd like to sit and have lunch with Teresa of Avila, who was a mystic from the 1500s in Avila, Spain. And she wrote her ideas of love and living fully and union with God all during the time of the Spanish Inquisition. So it's not surprising that what we have left from her is very religious in its phraseology, but there is still so much in her writing that she could not hide her exuberance and love and zest for life. When she was a young woman, part of the reason that she was sent to one monastery, she actually ended up living in a different monastery for most of her life, but at first she was sent to a monastery as a punishment because there was some scandal with boys in her youth, and so they were trying to get her on the straight and narrow again. She wrote several poems about life and trying to find that unity with your deepest self, which she would call, bridal mysticism with Christ, but what I would call just really knowing herself and loving the life that is within her and around her. One of her poems is called "Let Nothing Trouble You." The only thing you need is the love of God. And uh, in that poem, I don't have it with me, but in that poem, she speaks a lot about, life can get really, really hard. But if you can center in and let go of everything for a little bit and know yourself deeply, well, then it will be okay. So I would love to have lunch with her at a time when she doesn't have to worry about the Spanish Inquisition torturing her to death because she said the wrong thing about God or the universe or anything. And I would like to know what it was really like. In fact, one time I had like a meditation dream about her where she gave me a copy of one of her books. And I kind of said in the dream, I said, well, why are you giving me this? She says, because this is the book that I wrote, not the book that is out there now, that people still have. I mean, this is what she wrote what she really wanted to say, and not what the Inquisition made her say. So anybody who was wise enough to keep herself alive and doing her work while navigating such dangerous, censorious times. I want to know more about that.
Great. I'm the genie and I'll make you wishes all granted. Ha ha ha. Well, that brings us to our next question. Do you have a funny story or anything interesting that has happened through your writing poetry?
One thing is that I put away some of my poetry for a long time. And then I was going through to try to figure out which ones to put together in my chapbook. And what was really amazing is that I found this poem that seemed really good. And I was amazed to remember that I had written it. And that, that made me feel so good. There were so many pieces to it. There was the piece of how could I forget that I had written it? And then discovering it again, reading it as though I was completely a different person. It was it was pretty funny.
What is the most difficult part for you in being a poet?
Making the time to write. Um, you'd think that like not having work to do outside of the home, that and my schedule being mine, that it should be very easy for me to find the time to do it. But I have many things going on at the same time besides, my family and my friends. My health situation takes a lot of hours out of my day to manage. I also need a lot of extra rest. But it's not just the time, because with writing poetry, you can't say, okay, sit your, bottom down in that chair and don't move until you've come out with a poem. It doesn't work that way. I need to be in the contemplative, meditative frame of mind to allow the words to come up, to allow the imagination to work its magic and all of that. And so I want for that, at least I have a vision of like how I might need to live in order to be able to write more poetry. And I would like to do that.
Well, and I hate to break the news to you, but we're not 20 years old anymore. We are not able to do as much as we did when we were 20 years old. Remember when we could just go all night and dance and party all night and then have 2 hours of sleep and function all day? Those days are over, my dear friend. We
They're
need to
gone.
pace ourselves and we need to be nice to ourselves.
Well, even still, um there are many authors I like, poets, say Mary Oliver, for instance. She has so many books of poetry that I'm not sure that I will get through reading all of them that she has published, much less, of course, the unpublished ones. But um, so the world doesn't need 500 poems from me. The world needs maybe 100 good ones. And I think I'm pretty well on my way towards that.
I always thought you had much more than 100.
I should count them up. It's a stack about that high.
What is the most rewarding part for you in being a poet?
No question. The most rewarding part is coming down from the stage after having read one of my poems at the Owl and having somebody just sitting there looking at me, catching my eye and going, and put their hands over their heart in a kind of a hug. And that's it, that I knew that I helped give them the words for something that they themselves had not yet found the words for. And I love that. The other part I love is because um, I'm known as a poet there. It's the ability to encourage some of the newbies and the ability to say, especially to some of the younger ones, keep going, keep making time for this in your life because you're a really good poet.
I'm sure you have that look many times because your poetry is wonderful, and down to earth, and yet there's some mystical parts to it, and there's some human parts to it that reflects the beautiful person you are. Is there anything else you'd like to share other than your poem?
Yeah, I would like to say to everyone that the more you can be all of who you truly are, not only the happier you will be, but the world will be better for it. And what I mean is that you don't have to be a poet. You don't have to be a painter. You don't have to be any kind of an artist in any way. But you need to find where it is that you find your life and your sustenance and you feel truly who you are in, and then do more of that. That will be the most encouraging thing. I think so many young people see adults as being too stressed, too overworked, too bitter, too cynical. And so to find mentors that are happy in their lives, that have learned how to tell other people who they really are, I think that's the most wonderful thing in the world. And if that's, if that's poetry, like get to it and come to the owl and share it with us. If that's art in some way, get it out there. But if it's not, if it's telling stories to little kids, do more of it. I wrote a poem it was one of the anniversaries of Owl Poetry, and I wanted to encourage them to keep writing and to keep going on, and also to acknowledge how nervous so many of the new poets were in getting up and reading their poetry. So this is what I wrote. Carry on, fellow poets. I see you here on stage, voice quivering but soul shining. I hear your heart's words of joy or pain, memories or anger. I know the nervousness of reading your poetry first time in public. I know how bright that light is on stage, this microphone scary with its loudness. Wow, my voice, really? Oh, yes, really. Your voice, you, heart and soul visible, right here now. So filled with gratitude, I bow to all the poets here. I may never have met most of you if you hadn't dared to stand here naked and tell us what it's like to be you. People full of mystery and surprise. Listening to you inspires me to see strangers with more curiosity and hope. So what's it like for you? Tell me what troubles you, delights you, fills you with wonder. From despair to random kindnesses, from sex to spirituality, I hear from you how many ways there are to live a life, a good life. And I'm grateful to you, ordinary, beautiful people, so extraordinary in soul shining out, lanterns to those of us lost or frightened. You belong here, as do I. And we've all made a space, inviting others to belong to this adventure called life, this experiment in telling it like it is. Carry on, fellow poets. Let us carry on.
Thank you, Kat, for this beautiful interview. I'm so glad you were my first, like you were in so many other adventures. I really appreciate you and love you, and I can't thank you enough. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Poetic Encouragement Podcast Series. Like us, love us, follow us on Substack, Facebook, YouTube, or any platform you can find us on. Thank you again. I appreciate you.